Hi and welcome to Tutorial 15, Essay Writing 5, The Conclusion. Now that we've looked at how to write the introduction and the main body of an essay, our attention will turn to writing the conclusion and finishing the essay. The tutorial will cover the purpose and structure of the conclusion, common mistakes to avoid when writing conclusions, and finally we'll finish with some tips for completing and submitting your essay. Going back to our diagram of the essay structure, we can see that the conclusion is the final section of an essay. The conclusion should lead on from the final section of the main body of the essay and should be a logical ending that pulls all the sections of your essay together. Let's look more closely now at what should be included in a conclusion. The key purpose of a conclusion is pretty much just to provide a summary of the key points of your essay. Because you're simply summarising what you've already written, the conclusion is a fairly straightforward part of the essay to write. Conclusions are usually just a paragraph long, so they should be quite concise and not go into too much detail. So what should go in a conclusion? Well, a conclusion should include a summary of the key points covered in the main body of your essay. If the essay question asks you to make some kind of judgment about something, which a lot of questions will do, then the conclusion should also include a final comment on the subject. The final comment's really just a final statement that indicates your opinion based on what you've written. So for example, if you were asked to compare and contrast different theories of human life course development and their use in social work, your final comment could be a sentence summing up which theory is the strongest and most useful for social work. The final comment only needs to be a sentence or two long and is a useful way of bringing the essay to a close. This slide contains some points to avoid when writing conclusions. Firstly, students often misinterpret the purpose of a conclusion and they make writing the conclusion much harder than it actually is. It's quite common to think that the conclusion should end the essay in some kind of groundbreaking note or include statements that will have a strong impact on the reader. Remember that a conclusion really is just a simple summary of what you've already written in the main body, so there's no need to go overboard trying to impress your reader at this stage. The hard work should already have been done in the main body. Secondly, a conclusion should never introduce new material. It should only refer to what you've written in the main body. And thirdly, avoid focusing on minor points that you've made in your essay. The conclusion should just summarise the most important points. If you include minor points as well in your conclusion, it will become too detailed and a bit too repetitive. Finally, avoid ending your conclusion with long quotations. If you do decide to include a quotation, use one that sums up the main point that you've made. Avoid using a quotation just for the sake of it. Let's consider now how you might start your conclusion. Well, the first sentence of your conclusion should signal to the reader that you're about to bring the essay to a close. It's quite common to use the term "in conclusion" to do this, but these words can often come across as being a bit blunt and unexpected unless you've quite skillfully pointed towards your conclusion at the end of your main body, which is quite difficult to do. An easier and maybe more logical way to signal the start of your conclusion is to remind the reader what you actually set out to do, and this gives your essay a nice cyclical structure by referring back to what you wrote in the introduction. You can do this by simply stating the purpose of this essay was to... So let's now look at how to write the summary part of the conclusion. As indicated earlier, the key purpose of a conclusion is to summarise the points made in the essay. Summary should therefore form the bulk of the conclusion. So once you've restated the purpose of the essay, you can then start your summary section using a phrase like "it has been shown that." From there you should summarise the key points made throughout the main body of your essay from start to finish. The length of the summary will obviously depend on the length of your essay, but it should be condensed enough to fit within your concluding paragraph. As shown in the slide, a tip for making this easy is to slowly read through the main body of the essay and bullet point the key points made in each section on a blank sheet of paper. You can do this paragraph by paragraph, but remember only to include key points and not the minor points. Once you've done this, you should then have a list of bullet points that you can use to write your summary. Turn those bullet points into sentences and link them together, and there you've got your summary. To help link the sentences, phrases such as "it has also been shown that" can be used to make sure that your writing flows. Let's now consider how you might write the final comment. As indicated earlier, a final comment is useful when the essay question asks you to come to some kind of judgment or decision about something. So a final comment might not always be required. Remember that the final comment is really just a statement to indicate your opinion. Now, the nature of this statement will obviously depend on the essay question, but to give you an idea of what a final statement looks like, some examples are shown on the slide. Be aware though that if you are asked to make some kind of judgment, it's not always possible to draw a definitive conclusion, because the evidence might not point towards an obvious answer. In fact, quite often that is the case. If that's the case, it's fine to simply state that, as shown in the last example. You can pause the video while you read through the examples. This slide pulls together the previous slides to provide a template for writing your conclusion. You should be able to apply this to almost any essay, but remember that it is just a suggestion and you might want to use a slightly different format. The next slide provides an example conclusion. The conclusion shown in this slide has used the suggested template for structuring the conclusion. The different parts of the conclusion are shown in different colours. Before we move on to some final tips for finishing essays, pause the video and take some time to read through this slide. Before we move on to the final summary slide, here's a few tips for finishing essays. First of all, always review your essay and be prepared to make changes. You're unlikely to be totally happy with it first time round, so make sure that you allocate time to making some changes. Secondly, if you've been working on an essay quite intensely, it's a good idea to leave it for a few days before reviewing it or proofreading it. If you review it as soon as you're finished, you'll find that you're sort of so immersed in it that the mistakes won't stand out. So it's a much more effective way to review essays with a fresh perspective. Obviously that means your time management's got to be good though, so you'll need to think about how you're going to work your time around that. And thirdly, as you're reviewing the essay, ask yourself, has it answered the question? Have I included references for key ideas? Have I used an appropriate writing style? And fourthly, always proofread your work. If you hand in an essay with spelling and grammatical mistakes, it will look sloppy and your marker's unlikely to be impressed. Finally, make sure your essay is presented according to the presentation guidelines, which you'll find in the module handbook. These guidelines are quite specific and involve presentation guidelines such as your line spacing, the font type, and the number of copies to be submitted. It's not worth throwing away marks by not adhering to these guidelines, so make sure that you do follow them accurately. The key points of this tutorial are: the purpose of a conclusion is to summarise the main points of an essay. The conclusion should include an introductory sentence that restates the purpose of the essay, a summary of the key points of the essay, and a final comment if required. The conclusion should not include new material, reiteration of minor points, or long quotations. If you find it helpful, use the template suggested in this tutorial for structuring the conclusion. And finally, always review and proofread your essay and submit it according to the presentation guidelines. That's you now completed all the tutorials in this series.